In the autumn of 1887, in Reno County, Kansas, a crew was digging a water well on a quarter section a few miles out from Hutchinson. They were digging it by hand, the way every well was dug then. A shaft about 4 feet across, one man at the bottom with a pick and a bucket, two at the top on the windlass. The head of the crew was a Mennonite named Jacob Regier, one of the families that had come into Kansas in the 70s with turkey red wheat and stayed. By the 19th day they were through 60-odd feet of red clay and shale. Then the pick went in easy and came back ringing, and what came up the shaft was white. It was salt, a bed of clean rock salt, and they cut through 11 feet of it, and in that particular year, in that particular county, nobody found this remarkable at all. Salt had been struck by drilling near Hutchinson that same season, and within months there were works going up all over the district. The salt was solid. No seams of clay, no fractures, no water channels, nothing running through it. And Regier said afterward that this was the part that stayed with him, that the salt lay whole, like something poured, and that in 11 feet nothing had ever gone through it. At 90 feet the pick came down on stone and bounced. Regier cleared the bottom of the shaft, all 4 feet of it, and under the salt there was a floor, flat slabs laid tight with even joints. A knife blade would not go into the seams. The stone was not local. There is nothing in Reno County but soft sandstone and shale, and these were dense, dark, and heavy. Regier had a lamp lowered on a rope, and stayed down long enough that they called to him twice from the top. The floor was level, and it ran out past the cut of the shaft in every direction. By the evening of the next day, brine was coming into the shaft from the bed above, and overnight the well filled 20 feet. There was nothing more to dig with, and no reason to dig. A hole like that gives no stock water. Brine kills cattle, and it kills the crop it is put on, and a well that produces it is worse than no well at all. The landowner refused to pay for a dry well. The crew filled the shaft with clay and rubble and moved to another section. In Regier's daybook for that week there is an entry for the salt, an entry for the brine, a note that the work was not paid, and 2 lines under it. A flaw, stone not ours. 3 things came out of it: a daybook with those 2 lines, a filled well marked on a county plat, and a man who said for the rest of his life that under 11 feet of undisturbed salt in Kansas there is a stone floor laid by hand, and that nobody had ever disturbed the salt above it. The account belongs to a hand-well digger, and it is worth being exact about what that made him. Digging a well by hand is not unskilled labour. A man goes down a 4-foot hole with a pick and works in the dark at the bottom of a column of his own spoil, and everything that can kill him is a property of the ground: a seam that runs sand, a pocket that holds gas, a wall that will not stand without cribbing. He reads the material coming out of the hole because his life is the reading. He knows clay from shale by the way the pick sets. He knows when he is into water-bearing sand a foot before he is in it, and he knows the difference between a broken formation and a solid one, because one of them will come down on him and one will not. A man in that trade did not confuse a natural cavity with a laid surface, and he did not misjudge whether a bed had been cut through before. The second thing is the community he came out of. The Mennonites in that part of Kansas were a settled, literate, record-keeping people, farming on land bought in blocks, keeping accounts in daybooks because contracts were made on a handshake, and the book was the only proof. Regier's daybook is not a diary. It is a business record: dates, footage, materials, what was owed and what was paid. It has entries for barbed wire, for a doctor's visit, for hauling, for a horse that went lame. The two lines about the floor sit in the middle of an unpaid job, on the same page as the reason it was unpaid. That is not a man telling a story. It is a man writing down why 19 days of work came to nothing. And it means the one document that survives from the whole business was written by someone who had no audience for it, no reason to embellish it, and every reason to be accurate about a job he was arguing over. What he wrote down about the stone is short. What he wrote down about the salt is the part that turns out to matter. There are two details in the description of the floor, and both of them are checkable against the geology of the county. The first is the joints. Slabs laid so tightly that a knife will not enter the seam is not a description of natural bedding. Flat-lying rock does occur. Shale and limestone split along bedding planes and can look like paving, but bedded rock breaks along its own natural lines, and those lines run continuously through the whole formation. Laid slabs do not. They are individual pieces of similar thickness brought to a common level, with joints that run between them and stop, and with the joint lines meeting at angles that belong to the pieces and not to the rock. That distinction is not subtle to anyone standing on it with a lamp. The second detail is harder to argue with. The stone was not from there. Central Kansas at that depth is red Permian shale and soft sandstone, and neither of them produces dense, dark, heavy slabs. What does produce them is limestone, and Kansas has a great deal of limestone, in the Flint Hills, in the east, in outcrops that run in bands across the state, some of it excellent flat-splitting rock that later built half the towns in Kansas and was quarried for it. But those bands are not in Reno County. Stone of that kind, in that place, has to have been carried, and carried a distance measured in tens of miles across open prairie, by people with no wheeled transport, which is a great deal of effort for a floor. That is worth holding on to, because effort of that scale is the clearest signal there is that something mattered to whoever did it, and the effort is not the problem with the account. The problem with the account is the 11 feet of salt lying on top of it, and the objection that raises is not a small one. It is, on its face, fatal. The salt under central Kansas is Permian. It was laid down when a shallow sea covering the middle of the continent evaporated, and the age of that event is not in dispute at any level. It is roughly 275 million years. That is before the dinosaurs. It is 150 million years before there were flowering plants, and something like 274 million years before there was anything on the planet that could cut a stone. The Hutchinson salt is one of the best known and most thoroughly drilled formations in North America. It has been mapped in detail because an entire industry depends on knowing exactly where it lies, and there is no serious question about when it formed. So a stone floor lying underneath undisturbed Permian salt is not an anomaly. It is an impossibility, and it is the kind of impossibility that ends a conversation, because the only way to have it is for human beings to have been paving floors 250 million years before human beings existed. Any geologist presented with Regier's account would have stopped exactly there, and would have been right to. It is the correct objection, it is decisive, and it is the reason 2 lines in a daybook stayed 2 lines in a daybook for a century. Nobody suppressed it. Nobody needed to. But it rests on an assumption that goes unexamined precisely because it is usually correct, that salt found underground is the Permian bed. In Kansas, that assumption fails in specific, documented, dramatic ways, and the failure has been on the record since 8 years before Jacob Regier ever put a pick in the ground. Salt dissolves. That is the entire mechanism, and its consequences in Kansas are spectacular and well recorded. Where groundwater reaches a salt bed, it takes the salt into solution and carries it away, and the rock above, left unsupported, eventually drops into the space. On the surface, this appears as subsidence, and where it goes quickly, it appears as a hole. In March of 1879, in Meade County in southwest Kansas, the ground gave way and produced what became known as the Meade Salt Sink. A large depression that formed within a matter of days, was witnessed, was written about at the time, and filled with brine. It is not the only one. Kansas has a documented history of salt solution subsidence, some of it natural, a great deal of it later caused by drilling and by brine wells that let fresh water reach the salt where it never had before. Land in the salt districts has gone down under farms, under highways and under railroads. Sinks have opened wide enough to swallow track. It is still going on in places, and the state has studied it in detail because it has to. What matters for the account is what these features are. A salt sink is a closed basin. It fills with brine because the water reaching it has been running through salt. Brine in a closed basin in a dry climate evaporates, and when brine evaporates, it precipitates salt, new salt, clean salt, laid down in flat beds over whatever happens to be sitting at the bottom of the basin. The salt that forms in a sink is not the Permian bed. It has nothing to do with the Permian bed except that it came from it. It is young, it can be very young, and it lies exactly where the objection says nothing can lie, which means the question about the 11 feet over Regier's floor is not whether salt can cover a made surface, it is whether the salt he described was the old bed or the new kind, and he told anyone who would listen exactly which it was, without knowing that he had. Bedded Permian salt is not clean. It is interbedded with other evaporite minerals and with shale, and it carries partings, thin dark layers of clay and anhydrite that were deposited between the salt pulses as the ancient sea filled and dried again and again over thousands of years. Those partings are one of the standard means by which the formation is identified in a drill core. A driller going through the Hutchinson salt expects those partings, counts them and logs them, because they are how he knows where he is. Salt precipitated recently in a closed brine basin looks different. It is cleaner. It lacks that interbedded sequence, and it is laid down in a single continuous body rather than a stack of pulses separated by mud. Regier, who had no reason to know that any of this existed, said the salt in his shaft was solid, with no seams of clay running through it, and that in 11 feet nothing had ever gone through it. He described the absence of partings. He described it as the thing that stayed with him, because in a trade where every seam is a hazard, 11 feet of material with no seams in it is worth remembering. The second detail is the depth. The Hutchinson salt in that county does not lie at 79 feet. It lies far deeper, and any well record from the district will say so, which is why a hand-dug well striking rock salt that shallow is itself an anomaly. Shallow salt in a salt district is what fill in an old sink looks like. Everything in the account points the same direction. A closed basin, filled with brine, dried, filled again, sealing a floor that had been standing on ordinary ground before the ground went down. None of that is proven, and it cannot now be proven from 2 lines in a daybook. What can be established is the rest of it, and the rest of it is that people were building in Kansas on a scale that almost nobody remembers, in the exact part of the state where this well was dug. Near Arkansas City in south-central Kansas, there is a site called Etzanoa. It was a settlement of the ancestors of the Wichita people, and it was very large, Estimates run to thousands of residents spread across miles of terrace above the river, with houses, storage, garden plots and earthworks. It was not unknown to history in the way that phrase usually means. A Spanish expedition under Oñate reached it in 1601 and wrote about it, and the account described a substantial town. And then the account sat in the archives, and the site itself was farmed over, built on, and forgotten so completely that for centuries it was treated as an exaggeration by a Spaniard who had a reason to exaggerate. The site was re-identified and excavated in recent years, and the archaeology supports the scale. That is the documented case. Kansas held one of the larger population centers in North America north of Mexico. It was described in writing by Europeans 400 years ago, and the state on top of it forgot for 350 years that it had been there. And the people of that broad tradition on the Central Plains built substantially: council circles, earthworks, arranged structures set out to a plan. They also traded across enormous distances, and one of the commodities the plains moved was salt, gathered at springs and flats where it came to the surface on its own, carried along the same networks that moved stone, shell, and hide. Salt was not incidental on the plains. It was a resource worth going to, worth working, and worth defending. A people who worked salt sources, moved heavy material, and built to a plan is not a strange thing to find in central Kansas. It is what was there. What is strange is the idea that a floor of hauled stone could go into the ground and stay there without anyone in the following 400 years finding it. And the answer to that turns out to be simple and to have very little to do with mystery. 4 people are known to have asked about the well. In 1905, a state survey man named Harlan Speer, compiling salt occurrences in the district, came across a county plat with a filled well marked on it and a marginal notation about salt at an unusual depth, and wrote to the office asking whether any log had been retained for a hand-dug well of 1887. He was told that hand-dug wells were not logged and that no record existed. Speer noted the shallow occurrence in his own list as unverified. He died in 1931. The list survives. The entry is still marked unverified. In 1938, a woman named Ada Cleaver, collecting family papers for a county history project, was given Jacob Regier's daybook by his daughter, transcribed the pages about the unpaid job, including the 2 lines about the floor, and included a sentence about it in a chapter on early wells. The chapter was cut for length. She kept the transcription in her files and died in 1976. In 1978, an archivist named Marion Detweiler, processing the Cleaver papers at a county historical society, catalogued the daybook and the transcription together, and flagged the entry in the finding aid as a well digger's account of stone beneath salt. That note is still there, and in 2004 a retired man named Curtis Regier, a great-grandson, wrote to the state and to 2 salt companies, asking whether the location on the old plat could be identified and examined. The replies were straightforward and correct. Pre-1900 well records were not retained. The plat description was too coarse to locate a filled shaft within a quarter section, and the section in question had been inside a producing brine field for decades. That last point is the one that closes it. Salt in that district is not mined with a pick anymore. It is dissolved on purpose. Fresh water is pumped down, the salt goes into solution, and the brine is pumped back up and evaporated. Whatever was down there went up a pipe as saturated water sometime in the last 90 years and was sold. What is known is 2 lines and a plat, a daybook entry for 19 days of work, 11 feet of salt, 20 feet of brine, no payment, and a floor, stone not ours. A filled well marked on a county map with a description too coarse to find it again. A surveyman's list, with one shallow salt occurrence marked unverified. A cut chapter from a county history, a finding aid note written in 1978 and read by almost nobody since. What is not known is everything else. Nobody knows how far the floor ran past the 4 feet of shaft that exposed it, or what was on it, or what was around it, or how the ground it stood on came to be 90 feet down, because the only way to answer any of that would have been to open the ground, and the ground has since been dissolved and pumped out, and sold by the ton. Jacob Regier dug wells another 26 years, and died in 1913. He never claimed to know who laid the floor, or when, or why anyone would haul stone that far to make one. He said only that it was laid, that the stone had come from somewhere else, and that the salt above it had never been broken. Kansas is a place that held a city of thousands, was described in writing in 1601, and forgot it so thoroughly that for 3 centuries the description was treated as a lie. It is also a place where the ground has repeatedly fallen in, quickly, in front of witnesses, and filled with brine, and dried, and left flat white beds over whatever was at the bottom. Both of those are ordinary facts about Kansas. Somewhere in a quarter section outside Hutchinson there is a shaft filled with clay and rubble in 1887, and under it, if the daybook is right, there is a floor of hauled stone, laid tight enough to turn a knife blade. The salt that covered it is gone now. It left in solution, through a pipe, in water pumped down from the surface by people who were not looking for anything except salt, and who found exactly what they were looking for.